within you. Awake to fit it in every creature, in every woman, in every man. It is our river of resurrection, the promise of new beginnings. Awake, O my soul, to the flow of the divine deep within you. Awake, O my soul. All right. It's a heavy week and a heavy world, it feels like. I don't know how, but one of the things that one of the blogs I read talks about is it's easy to get discouraged by the brokenness of the macro world, everything up there that is tragically and so obviously broken this week, for the last couple of weeks. And so he urges us, my blog writer, to turn our attention to the micro world where we can, in fact, make a difference. I think that the disciples and Jesus had a huge advantage in not being exposed to all the crap that we are exposed to day in, day out.
Absolutely.
I think we suffer from information overload, and it's always the bad news that makes the news. And so we're just inundated with it. It seems to me essential that our religious faith nourish us in the face of both the macro world and the micro. I think that there is something particularly friendly to the micro world in this tradition that we're reading, where the king is not the oriental potentate, the tyrant, even with benign intent, but is rather a country squire, a much more accessible and approachable image for God. So think about how that works for you, and how anything in this book and our study of it feeds you to be kind in this micro world at least, and perhaps directs you for kindness in the macro world. So, does anybody know if the protocols for masks has been changed?
Not that I haven't said.
I see the sign is no longer on the church door that we must wear masks.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So,
Go ahead, Mark.
I would love not to wear this. Are you okay with
Yeah.
just
Yeah, please, it's too hard to
It would be
sit
easier-
back from me?
you know, when we were walking over, I was going to say to you, it would be better for you not to wear the mask because it muffles your speech.
It does.
Can't
I also
muffle
have to
him.
practice in speaking louder too, so when you do take it off.
Yes.
And we can't have Martin muffled.
No.
Impossible, right?
Yeah, it's not possible.
So do you now all have the book?
Okay.
Does anybody want a second one? All right. I will find a use for it, I am sure. We'll follow the same format of going through the chapter. We'll start on page 71, for any of you who want us to follow. I used highlighters so much in this chapter that I might just as well not have used it.
Welcome to the club.
But as we begin, what kind of raised awarenesses are any of us having about our own interior life? And what has this book so far prompted in you as kind of an aha? Oh, that's what that means.
I'm not going to speak to my revelation in eternal life, but yesterday's Writer's Almanac, the poem that they started with,
The music.
yes,
Loved it.
I pulled it up. To me, it spoke to his philosophy of the world and how we're all related and that larger.
Do you happen to have it in front of
I
you?
do. Would you like to read it?
No, I'd like you to read it loudly.
Keep your mouth down just while you read it, it's very hard to hear.
Glasses would have to.
I
At the
sent
most,
this out to a few people yesterday, by the way, my musical friends.
yeah. At its most beautiful, wait, that's not the beginning. When I was a child, I once sat sobbing on the floor beside my mother's piano as she played and sang, for there was in her singing a shy yet solemn glory my smallness could not hold. And when I was asked why I was crying, I had no words for it. I only shook my head and went on crying. Why is it that music, at its most beautiful, opens a wound in us, an ache, a desolation, deep as a homesickness for some far-off and half-forgotten country? I've never understood why this is so, but there's an ancient legend from the other side of the world that gives away the secret of this mysterious sorrow. For centuries on centuries, we have been wandering, but we were made for paradise, as deer for the forest. And when music comes to us with its heavenly beauty, it brings us desolation, for when we hear it, we half remember that lost native country. We dimly remember the fields, their fragrant wind-swept clover, the bird songs in the orchards, the wild white violets in the moss. By the transparent streams and shining at the heart of it is the longed-for beauty of the one who waits for us, who will always wait for us in those radiant meadows, yet also came to live with us and wanders where we wander.
For me, it confirmed some of the ideas that I already
Louder.
It confirmed some of the ideas that I already had. A number of them playing around my head, mainly coming from Native American spirituality. And when I found this in our own tradition, I said, aha, there is something right
Yeah.
about the Christian tradition. I mean, more than just the basic kind of things. And so the 2 or 3 teachings you've done on Celtic spirituality have done that for me, to look more toward that as the more truthful one for my own experience of spirituality.
Good.
And there are 3 things that really struck me here that he talks about here. One is on the teachings, the teachings of the Orthodox Roman Church as opposed to the Eastern Orthodox and the Celtic of original sin. In the Celtic and the Eastern Orthodox, that does not exist. Everything is born beautiful like a new baby. That's powerful. Second thing is, in the Roman Church is the subjugation of a woman's role. In the Celtic and Eastern Orthodox, women are seen equal, with equal power. All people are seen full of spirituality, including men. Not just women, but all. And the third
Even
thing,
men.
yeah, the third thing is the hierarchy. The Celtic groups did not believe in this hierarchy. That it was more of a shared leadership. That's very Native American. And so those 3 things have really resonated for me. The other thing is that it has helped me a little bit go with a kind of angle in my poetry, being a little bit more bold about the experience of the holy and the sacred in the natural world. I have a little poem here I wrote 2 days ago. I think Martin saw it, commented on it, which is good. Made an interesting observation. But this is something that I'm speaking. It's called There. There. In these late past noon minutes, the drifting utterances from the foliage lost, grieving grove, and the wiry, lopsided young trunks, like the small brushings of wind now on my strangely attuned eardrums, utterances from the pale winter-sunk sun. Like thrummings from the half-frozen ground, rising up through my old brittle bones. Not long lingering, but there, all around, like the skeletal imprints of crumbling leaves, leaving their cast on the perfect forest earth, easing in like the late evening pink glimmerings on the smooth, dark surfaces of the soundless trees. There, just there.
I just say something, feeding on what you just said about
Louder.
feeding on what Jack just said about the parallels with the Native American tradition. He says at the top of page 12, he talks about the Celtic tradition and invites us to look for this light in one another and everything that has being. And as soon as I heard that, I thought of the Quakers, and then he goes on to say that attending this talk this evening was a young Mohawk elder who had been invited there specifically to make observations at the end of my talk about the resonances between Celtic and Native wisdom. The Mohawk elder stood with tears in his eyes as he spoke, and he said, "As I have been listening to these themes, I've been wondering where I would be tonight. I've been wondering where my people would be tonight, and I've been wondering where we would be as a Western world tonight if the mission that had come to us from Europe centuries ago had come expecting to find the light in us." I thought that was a very powerful statement.
Yeah, I like that too. Well, let's turn our attention to sacred flow. Celtic wisdom looks for the flow of the divine deep within everything that has being. John Scotus. Scotus, by the way, means Irish. It's weird for us who think of Scotus meaning Scottish, but it means Irish. The Scots were
the United States.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No. The Scots were Caledonians.
The word Scot actually translates as foreigner.
As what? Your
Foreigner.
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 That's enough.
Yeah.
Whatever.
It is the very essence of everything that exists. John Scotus, Eriugena, awakens us to look for the flow of the divine deep within all things and to release it within ourselves and one another. It's reference to Pelagius. At the time of Pelagius' ban, the Roman army had already withdrawn from Britain to stem the barbarian invasions throughout Europe. The Visigoths had sacked Rome in the year 410 under the leadership of King Alaric, thus beginning a separation between imperial Christianity and the Christianity of Celtic Britain that would last for nearly 200 years. The Celtic tradition was given breathing space in which to develop without the heavy-handed interference of the empire. That's a critical thing for us to understand. This little 22-mile stretch right there protected the British Isles from the kind of dominance that the rest of Europe experienced, and very significant. I, by the way, was born right there, and this area, which is flatland, was the first area to be radically affected by Augustine, who landed right there and set up his home base in Canterbury right there. As close as he could possibly be to the Imperial Church and mainland Europe. Whereas Iona is up here, a little island, Lindisfarne, another little island right there. A long way away from imperial influence. So, this is Hadrian's Wall. So Lindisfarne, this whole area is above, is sort of away from imperial influence. And again, this water, the Irish Sea, protected Ireland even more.
So just a question, so that's why Canterbury to this day is the seat of the Church of England, is because all those many years ago, Augustine established his,
Yes.
whatever you call
Yes.
it there.
Yes, in 497, he arrived and set up, he was the Archbishop of the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Interestingly, there are two archiepiscopal dioceses and jurisdictions in England. There is Canterbury, which is generally regarded as prime, but there's also York, which is up here and still very friendly. York is not so very far from Whitby, which was a critically important, there was a double monastery governed by Hilda, St. Hilda. She was double monastery, meaning both men and women in it. So, so that separation is cardinal. It's vital to everything. A contemporary of Pelagius was St. Patrick, and although Patrick was trained by the Roman Church in Gaul, and thus is not as pure an expression of the Celtic tradition as Pelagius and Bridget, the prayer that was attributed to him in later centuries is typical of the Celtic vision of the interweaving of spirit and matter and the seeking of the divine within the naturalness of the physical world. And let me turn this off. Didn't know it was on. Sorry about that. And these, I'll bring one down. Just a good visual. Oh,
Yeah, just lift up.
The mic made stands, didn't it?
I have always identified this cross.
Design defect.
Well, there it is. As the classical Western vertical, horizontal, and the circle representing creation, perhaps the sun, coming from pre-Christian, probably Druidic, pagan worship, centered right here, that both the cross and creation have the same vital center. This cross, this is a terrible example of that. I should have brought the...
Martin, of course, teacher Pat.
Oh, okay, yes. Murdoch's cross, which is probably the most famous and ornate cross, but follows a great tradition of the carving on the face of the cross, both east and west face, are biblical stories. And on the west face, I think it is, the cruciform shape is the crucifixion in agony, and on the other side, the cruciform is king reigning, and it's a symbol of resurrection. And all of the other illustrations are most typically biblical figures or ancient patristic figures. Some of the most important figures carved into several of the crosses. And there are about, I don't know how many of these high crosses there are in Ireland, but dozens. And St. Anthony of the Desert is one of the favorite people to depict. He was kind of very much in the tradition that we've been thinking about, although he predated it. There's a wonderful story of Anthony in the desert on a fast and starving, and a bird brings him a loaf of bread and feeds him. Again, kind of the uniting of the natural world and true humility and Christian faith. So, but one of the things I wanted to point out, because it's relevant to what Eriugena is talking about, these crosses, this, all are dating mostly to the 8th and 9th centuries. And then there was a lull, a period where the high crosses weren't made, none have survived. But then, in the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a revival of making these high crosses, but with a radical difference. The cross at Achillinora, you can see it here. I'll pass it around, but it's this one, on this side. Doesn't have biblical stories on it. It has 3 bishops. All of a sudden, and this is in the 11th century when the Benedictine order is dominant and where imperial Christianity has taken over. Pretty much vanquished the ancient, but there's an interesting detail in this cross that is easy to miss. I would have missed it had I not read a commentary on what the cross is. There are two bishops at the bottom, and they each have a crosier, but one is a Tor crosier, a Tor cross at the top of his crosier, which is symbolic of the Eastern Church, Orthodoxy. The other has a simple shepherd's crook, which represents Celtic tradition. And these are at the bottom of the cross and smaller. The dominant bishop is carrying a curly crosier, which is symbolic of Roman tradition. So while somebody is trying to be politically correct in making this design of sort of acknowledging the historical episcopate in Ireland, but giving supremacy to the Roman domination. Pass that picture around. It's difficult to make out if you don't know what it is, but once you know, it's pretty clear.
Well, whatever works, I guess. I mean, it's still there, it wasn't torn down, so I guess it must have worked.
Yeah, right. And these are pictures.
We can sneak it in. Well, yeah.
These are pictures that we took in County Meath 2 years ago. So, well, let's go forward. The St. Patrick's breastplate, while it doesn't really date to St. Patrick, Patrick's style of evangelism, of honoring this tradition that predates Christian tradition, treating it as another Old Testament, is memorialized in this wonderful hymn, which has been played at every one of my ordinations. I bind unto myself today the virtues of the starlit heaven, the glorious sun's life-giving rays, the whiteness of the moon at even, the flashing of the lightning free, the whirling winds, tempestuous shocks, the stable earth, the deep salt sea around the old eternal rocks. I love that verse particularly. I had not realized something that is pointed out here. It is interesting to note that this fourth verse, which I just read, in which the graces of nature are invoked, is entirely omitted or asterisked as optional in many Western Christian hymn books. That is sad, but it is a commentary on our attitude, the tragic separation between grace and nature. And we urgently need to awaken again to the reintegration of the spiritual and the physical if we are to begin to reverse the threat to planetary existence as we have known it. And with the latest, just within the last week or so, that the degradation of our atmosphere has gone perhaps to beyond a level that from which we can recover. And we don't seem to care. We do not seem to care.
My sense is that we care, but only if it doesn't personally inconvenience us.
Right, yeah. We want to support Ukraine as long as we don't have to spend $5 a gallon for gas. Pretty damn cynical.
I think that had a lot to do with what we were referring to earlier about the bombardment of too much information around the world. Because I think when I reflect on my childhood, I think there was when information wasn't instantaneous, and you depended on newspapers, that there seemed to be a more sacred feeling about the earth, the farmers and the everyday life. You depend upon the rotation of the seasons and all of that, because it was a smaller microcosm, like you were saying, that we lived in, but as that expanded and grew, and we were forced to think about so many other things in the world going on, it just left us feeling like helpless.
Yeah.
I know on my computer that probably everybody gets a lot of emails. They drop into my computer like cluster bombs. 25, 30, 98% of which I have no interest in.
Yes.
And I have to click, but if I don't click them off, they just build up and build up, and God knows what will happen to the computer. And that kind of thing is very, very hard on the nervous system, I think. Even those bright screens are, because they're not natural light. And there's a lot been written by neuroscientists on the neurological kind of damage, you might say, meta effects of computer technology. So, yeah, I mean, that time Terry was talking about, I experienced as well. And we had maybe a TV we watch once in a while, and
If you had a TV.
if you had TV, and there was the radio in the morning, and had a little town newspaper, which is told mostly the town news, and that
we're
was
all
it.
a lot happier.
I mean, spend a lot of time outside playing,
Yes.
That kind of. Yeah.
We were the blessed generation.
The difference between the two streams of Christianity were enormous. Over the 200-year period of separation, the imperial church had increasingly accentuated the doctrine of original sin in its teaching and practice. On the other hand, the Celtic Church, like the Eastern Orthodox tradition, had continued to celebrate that what is deepest in the newborn child, and thus at the heart of every woman and man, is the dignity of the divine. On Ash Wednesday last week, Barbara and I were reading together the Ash Wednesday service, which includes a recitation of Psalm 51. And Barbara pointed out that one of the lines in that is, I have been sinful from my mother's womb.
Wow.
What do we do with that? We wondered aloud.
how can somebody assume that you
Louder?
How can we assume that we've even started sinning before we even passed out of the
We're
birth
taught
canal?
that.
That's the question.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's always been, the difference between my feelings about humanity and what I was taught in church, and especially in the Catholic Church, that people are inherently, I feel, inherently good and wonderful and sacred, but you're taught that people are inherently bad and already stained and have to work so hard to redeem themselves, just because of that.
Well, I don't think that that's a spiritual insight of the church at all. It's political. Because if it tends to lean toward a reward and punishment system, okay? The church has sway. Because they can relieve you of your sin and give you absolution and all that. It gives them power.
You're right,
I think it's
but
all power.
what about what the psalmist said 700 years before that?
Well, I'm getting to that. Okay, so in a moment of, I guess you would say of craziness, he may have put that down. Maybe he was feeling bad or that day, or he'd been done something really bad, and then yet the whole mainline religious, kind of ossified religious establishment would say, oh, see here, right here. And they don't look at Genesis chapter 1. Right here, it said it right here. He said that, and by God, that's what we believe in. Heck with Genesis 1, Genesis chapter 1.
I'm sorry, where's that idea come from that was sin from my mother's womb? Where's that come from?
Well, the way I make sense of that is that it is hyperbole, for one thing, which is a poetic device. Remember that this was a pre-literate culture who was writing that, as was the Celtic culture of Ireland, pre-literate, which is not the same as illiterate, understand? Most people needed vivid visual stories. It's why the stories of the first few chapters of Genesis are so memorable. They are vivid, they are simple, and they resonate with some kind of internal awareness of brokenness, separation from what we know as holy. And so the stories sort of just affirm us in that self-understanding of being separate, of alienated from what is holy. But it's said in a very dramatic, extreme way. I absolutely have a sense of my own brokenness. And so to speak of myself as being broken even from the time of my birth is simply a hyperbolic way of saying that. It is not biology. Mike?
For me, it's a much more cynical view of this.
Surprising.
But if, on a level, looking at the debate that occurred, whether it's Pelagius, and Augustine, we have this political drama that plays out. And original sin becomes an element of control. I mean, it's just fundamentally a matter of control. And the sad, I find this reading, I love it, and it's what I truly believe, but it makes me sad that we continue to repeat in history the political drama, of using the church to control people. And using, all of it for a purpose which we hope it wasn't, for which it wasn't intended.
Yes, Lynn.
I took the Bible study course with Dr. Kata, whatever her name is, and she did an understanding the Psalms, and it was very helpful for me because I don't get them mostly. Usually they are saying angry things like that, and I think, where does this help? But like the Psalms of Lament, she said, people address God as if they were talking to somebody right there, and they just released all their anxiety and angst, and just, like you say, hyperbolically just said what was wrong in their life, and not blaming God, but just saying, look at all this that's happened to me, kind of a Job sort of a thing. And then at the end, they usually say, help me find the strength to do this, or I praise you anyway, you know, which is the Job story. Although this is all happening to me and I feel like I'm wicked, and, you know, everybody has those human nature things and you wish you didn't act the way you did, I still honor you as God, and I'm still going to try to move in that direction. And that made more sense to me than trying to believe the angry stuff is something I should know about or remember.
Well, there's that idea also we talked about, is that when at the end of a psalm, like a psalm of lament, when there would be this declaration of praising God, I know you will help. That's the memory of being rescued from Israel, being rescued from Egypt. They have that memory that God acted in history. And they call on that, I think, in the Psalms. I know that you will, God, you will deliver me. And also, beginning of those Psalms, there's that kind of a statement. So those are the bookends. And then the lament is in the song. And then, you know, today, I don't know. I have no memory of an event in my Christian life of Christians, except that of Jesus, when he was raised from the dead. That was the deliverance in the Christian, you know, world, I think. But I think we talked about that, is that that memory, that cultural memory of Jesus taking the Hebrews out of Egypt and giving them a promised land, promised place to come. That's embedded deeply in the Hebrew memory. And that's what often gets called upon in these songs, I believe.
Well,
anyway, that's a extra.
This is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but were any of the rest of you taught in your 8th grade confirmation classes the acronym for prayer, ACTS? Adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. There's no mention of lament in there.
Yeah.
Lament is a lost form of prayer. And I think you're raising it as what the Psalms often are.
87% of them are in that form, I believe. It's
I'd never
it's
attached a
really
percentage to it, but
Roseanne Campbell said
it
it's
is,
really high.
it is evident. And, you know, some of the, yesterday, the poem with which you started is an echo of lament in many ways. And a week from tomorrow, I'm flying to Vancouver to be with my sister-in-law, who is dying of cancer and in very bad shape, and she has an appointment with death on Wednesday the 16th at 4 o'clock. She is having physician-assisted suicide, and she wanted me to be there. And yesterday, and ever since actually, and we've known this for about a week, and Barbara and I have several times listened to the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which absolutely brings tears to my eyes. It is the most lamenting piece of music I know. Yet it's somehow evocative of beauty. I don't know how he did that. But it's one of, and if you don't know it, just ask Siri or Alexa to play the first movement. Don't go to the second and third, they'll just annoy you. But the first movement kills me. And I hope that I can play it for my sister-in-law on her day, on her appointment.
Did you all see on the news, I think I texted you about that, the opening season of the Metropolitan Opera, and the people on stage, and I'm not sure who they were, sang the Ukrainian national anthem.
Oh, yeah, I heard that.
And the
Yeah, one of the
audience stood, and
baritones is
that
a
brought me
young-
to tears just watching it on the news.
Yeah, music can do that to us. Pavarotti can reduce me to tears, as Barbara will tell you, just with one single note. All right. Arrived in Britain. Oh, yeah. The other thing, other than control, one of the media of control is uniformity. That's what the imperial church wanted. And that was what was scuttled at the Council of Whitby in 664, when people from here, the King Oswy of Northumbria up here, he was married to a wife from down here who had been formed in the imperial Roman tradition. He had been formed up here in the Celtic tradition. And he was having spats at home about particularly the dating of Easter. And the Celtic Church followed the tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and typically Easter is a week before or after. Sometimes it's the same as what the Western Church celebrates, but not very often. And so Oswy wanted to calm the fractures in his own household and convened the authorities. Wilfrid, who was the emissary from Rome, from down here, came up to Whitby, and Coleman, who was the representative of Celtic tradition, came here to Whitby on the northwest east coast of England. And for 3 days they debated which was the correct tradition. Wilfrid appealed to the authority of St. Peter, who had the keys to heaven, and Coleman appealed to the authority of the beloved disciple John, who listened to the heartbeat of God as he rested his head on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. The issue was resolved on the basis of superstition. Oswy chose the tradition of Peter because Peter had authority to keep Oswy out of heaven, and he didn't want to risk that. And so that was the basis for obliterating the one single major event that squelched Celtic tradition. And it took several hundred years for it to take hold, but it took hold. And gradually was pushed further and further back. Uniformity. And the Reformation of the Lutheran, Anglican Reformation of the 16th century was a rebellion against absolute uniformity.
Martin,
Yes.
when we were visiting Rome, Beau took us to this church that the community had started in the year 40. And the church itself was down it was out the outside steps that took you down, because the level where this church was, for centuries, everything else had built up and they just kept it available. So we went inside, and it was appointed with mosaics and small, and I believe it was the same church where those sisters that had gone to the Colosseum and gathered the bodies of the chewed up Christians and buried them where they were buried. But while we were there was a small little space where if you wanted to buy something from their Simple Little Books sale store, you could. But it was also something to do with maintaining the church. And while we were there, this little woman walked in from the community. She did not look prosperous, I will say. And she walked up to the desk of this man, and she put down some coinage. And he just very, not callously, but not with a lot of emotion or hospitality to her, pulled over this big giant book and flipped through it, I thought, looking for her name, and he wrote down the amount of what she had given. And in that instant, I got this impression of the obligation she felt to give whatever she could to her church, and the callousness of the church for taking it from her.
Yeah.
And I made that up in my head, but it just came so through to me. Do you remember her? Yeah. And I just thought, oh my gosh, you know, this is that imperial control that you're talking about.
Something that I want to get to, page 78. I hope you'll all read the chapter. It's, I think, as I said, maybe the best chapter in the whole book. My two favorites are Pelagius and Eriugena. Augustine first asked the Pope, Gregory, may a woman enter church at the time of menstruation, and may she receive communion at these times? And goes on to ask a series of questions along those lines. What in God's name is that about? What is the preoccupation with sex, and where does it come from? We all are post-Freudian, and so you get the Freudian symbolism of the snake as the tempter in Eden. But there is nothing about sex in that story.
I wondered if that wasn't something to do with the original sin idea.
What?
You know, that you're born out of lust, you know, and a bloody situation, and I'm wondering if that's, when you talk about baptism, when you wash your sins, you know, is that some correlation between the condition of birth?
I think everything that you just said, though, is post-Augustine.
No, that's true.
All of your awareness, all of our awarenesses is totally poisoned by this attitude.
I think
It's
it's
the Jewish
I think it's simpler
attitude.
than that. I think it's control.
Yeah.
Control of women. I mean, maybe that's the feminist in me, but it just feels to me that that was all, I don't know that, I'm not saying that Augustine was particularly conscious of that, but my guess is that was a way to control.
You
But
have to look
wasn't he
at
like a
Augustine's
rabble
history.
rouser, playboy, crazy guy
Yeah, that's his history.
in his early life and wrote
He used to be like an ex-alcoholic,
Yeah.
an ex-addict. They really super bad about, he sees women as evil because they tempt men with their sexuality.
And Augustine got
That's his
crazier
own-
and crazier the older he got.
All his own mental health problems. But he had all this sway. I mean, I was reading
So
here that the
how did it happen that he had such power to fix in the minds of an entire Western culture such bizarre, crazy notions?
'cause the
Why
church-
did we all, for centuries, for 1,500 or more years, succumb to that? Why
because
did we
the
allow
church
that to
could
happen?
use it
Because
politically, keep power.
there's a unconscious dynamic that when you worship the Virgin Mary, then there's a polarization you set up that all other women by definition.
Yeah.
And Augustine's a perfect example of that. The women that he interacted with were whores. And so there's the, am I getting too deep here?
No, you're allowed to be deep.
And so,
Comes with your
so you, how does it resonate with it? Well, how can, Augustine can only say that if everyone else agrees. So what I'm saying is that that's a kind of a collective unconscious thing that's going on there, where the patriarchy says, okay, so Virgin Mary is pure, but then every other woman by definition is tainted. And so that's they can't be menstruating when they're defiled and all that. I mean, it's all of a piece. Sorry, that's my read on it.
Well, I
And
think
by
again,
contrast, St. Bridget is a midwife
Right.
who honors the whole process of birth.
I think that, again, it fits into the church's ability to control. Because if you they found out, planted in people's head that sexuality is bad. And that's why priests aren't married, because they will not be, because they can't be totally divine if they're having sex with their wives. Therefore, because everybody is sexual and enjoys sex, they can go to church for absolution, you see. And so it's, I think again it gets back to control. Not so much the sexual act itself, but hey, we have a powerful tool here to control people, to stay in power. Now I know that in the Middle Ages, all the escathedral literature, the songs, ballads, poetry, highlighted romance between the sexes, sexuality, as next to godliness. It was a spiritual, highly spiritual experience. And if you read some of the literature of that period, Tristan and Isolde, Abelard and Eloise, two examples. And of course, at the end of that,
they both became celibate.
well, what happened was they castrated. That's why he became celibate, because of his act. But in Romeo and Juliet, I mean, look at her language, or his language. He sees her and he says, "She doth hang on the cheek of night like a jewel in an Aesop's ear." Celibate. That's been called Shakespeare's Song of Solomon. And she says at one point, "My love is boundless, as deep as the sea. The more I have, the more I give, the more I have. The both are infinite." That's highly spiritual language. I could talk about God that way. You know, so, I mean, what was going on outside the church, I think, preserved the beauty of sexuality. Just kind of.
I have another personal story to tell before we, that I got to tell because this is where it belongs. On page 89, Eriugena believes that Satan in the end will return to himself, for at the heart of his being and at the heart of all being is the light that the darkness has not overcome. Even Satan, with the name Lucifer, meaning son of light, or child of light, is redeemable. When Barbara and I were having some work done on our house, very fair amount, we had a stone carving that I'd made one time in a workshop. This head stands for that sign, and it's called the sorrowful devil. It's got horns, and it's got one big tear rolling down his cheek. Our contractor at the time doubled as a Pentecostal preacher. And he said, there ain't no such thing as a sorrowful devil. If we were out and he was working in that section of the house, he put that statue in a closet. He would not work in the presence of this sorrowful devil.
At least he didn't chip off the tear.
Yeah.
It's time to go to church, people. Thank you all very much. Next week, we will be working with, who's next? Alex Scott, Sacred Imagination. Yeah, and it's in another, we kind of jump forward about 8 centuries to get to John Scott. But again, it's good. It's time. Yeah.